A fitness protocol demanding maximal lower body loading every single day contradicts basic recovery principles. Yet, athletes following high-frequency, large muscle mass training protocols consistently achieve rapid, systemic fat loss without restricting their caloric intake. The standard fitness industry explanation relies on thermodynamics. The assumption is that moving heavy weights requires enough joules of energy to create a deficit through work alone. This data comparison tracks caloric burn on the left against acute post-exercise hormonal release on the right. These nonlinear spikes represent a localized metabolic stress that dictates a systemic lipolytic response. The squat triggers the specific chemical signaling because of its massive biomechanical scale. To see how a physical motion manipulates body chemistry, we have to trace the exact pathway, from mechanical joint flexion to localized muscle stress, and finally to systemic hormonal lipolysis. Squat-induced fat loss is a deliberate endocrine adaptation. Effectiveness is measured by chemical signals, not just joules of work. The physiological baseline for this response is extreme tension. Striated muscle fibers must stretch and contract dynamically under massive mechanical stress. During the eccentric descent phase, the lumbopelvic hip complex handles the primary mechanical load. The joints rotate into deep flexion to absorb the downward force. The gluteus maximus operates as the prime mover at the hip. As the body's largest superficial muscle, the gluteus undergoes massive elongation followed by powerful contraction. Simultaneously, the knee transitions between flexion and extension to control the speed and depth of the descent. This engages the specific, dense muscle bellies of the quadriceps complex, the vastus lateralis, intermedius, medialis, and rectus femoris. The rectus femoris crosses both the hip and the knee joints. This structural reality makes the movement highly complex, forcing the nervous system to coordinate and recruit surrounding secondary tissues. At the base, the ankle requires significant dorsiflexion, allowing the tibia to track forward to maintain balance over the body's center of gravity. To stabilize this descent, a network of synergists and antagonists must engage, specifically the hamstrings and the calf complex, comprised of the soleus and gastrocnemius. This simultaneous multi-joint activation engages a higher percentage of total body skeletal muscle mass than any other standard movement. Firing this volume of tissue establishes the mandatory physiological prerequisite for system-wide metabolic stress. Moving this muscle cross-section under heavy load demands extreme, localized energy production. This cross-section of the vastus lateralis shows how moderate to high-volume squatting forces the tissue to rely on anaerobic glycolysis, burning through stored glycogen. This energy pathway generates a specific chemical byproduct, the rapid accumulation of hydrogen ions, driving the muscle into lactic acidosis. Research from exercise physiologist William Kramer maps a direct biological link between resistance training volume and blood lactate concentration. Kramer's data establishes that high blood lactate levels correlate with the sheer physical volume of large muscle mass recruited, rather than simply the degree of perceived effort. The physical sensation of muscle fatigue is a measurable chemical threshold being crossed in the bloodstream. This localized accumulation of lactate acts as the direct biological signaling mechanism for the central endocrine system. As the highly acidic blood circulates through the body, it is rapidly detected by the anterior pituitary and the adrenal glands in the brain. Lactic acidosis initiates the systemic release of lipolytic hormones. Glandular detection of blood acidity triggers a systemic reaction, establishing a distinct timeline of hormonal release immediately post-exercise. This chart, tracking 0 to 60 minutes post-exercise, plots a sharp, immediate spike in catecholamines. Epinephrine and norepinephrine serve as the first responders, often surging in anticipation before the lift begins. These catecholamines rapidly mobilize stored energy, triggering lipolysis in adipose tissue to supply the body's massive structural demand. A secondary response follows, a rise in the 22 kilodalton growth hormone molecule. The anterior pituitary secretes this specific hormone in direct response to lactic acidosis. Growth hormone acts as a sustained driver of tissue remodeling and prolonged fat oxidation that lasts well after the workout ends. Finally, this third curve shows an acute elevation in total testosterone, aligning with the growth hormone spike. Large muscle mass exercises possess the mechanical scale required to consistently elicit this acute total testosterone elevation. Isolation movements fail to cross this necessary threshold. Testosterone mitigates immediate muscle breakdown and augments the lipolytic effects of growth hormone and IGF-1. These hormones eventually clear from the bloodstream, but their localized fat-oxidizing effects persist at the tissue level. This specific post-exercise hormonal milieu is the biological engine of systemic body recomposition. Protocols demanding maximal squats for 100 consecutive days introduce a biological paradox. The body must avoid catabolic collapse under daily, unyielding load. The primary threat is the release of cortisol during heavy metabolic stress. This 7-day timeline plots sharp daily spikes in cortisol. Cortisol rises alongside growth hormone to liberate amino acids, signaling tissue breakdown. The lifter survives through glucocorticoid receptor downregulation. This fading trend line represents the muscle's receptors becoming less sensitive to cortisol over time. This downregulation dampens catabolic effects, while the lipolytic benefits of growth hormone and catecholamines remain active. But an adapted endocrine system does not protect against the mechanical limits of the human body. Ignoring load management leads directly to physical failure. Extreme frequency introduces severe biomechanical risks. Persistent antagonist contraction without recovery forces the hip flexors into a shortened state, leading to groin and hip injuries. Central nervous system fatigue remains a hard physiological limit, regardless of how the body manages its hormones. Daily squatting weaponizes hormonal adaptation for fat loss, but it demands hyper-precise load management to avoid catastrophic mechanical failure. This flowchart tracks the pathway from barbell load to glute and quad activation, lactic acidosis, pituitary and adrenal release, and finally, adipose lipolysis. Engaging the foot, knee, and hip simultaneously is a strict biological threshold. Every subsequent chemical reaction requires this initial mechanical trigger. Smaller, isolated movements lack the physical scale to force this chain reaction. They cannot recruit enough tissue mass to reach the threshold. Fat loss protocols are accurately evaluated by their capacity to induce acute neuroendocrine shifts, not by the caloric deficits they create. Ultimately, the heavy squat functions as a precise biomechanical trigger that completely rewrites the human body's entire chemical environment.